Wasn't sure. All right, hello. My name is Scott Goldstein. I'm the web librarian at Appalachian State University here in Boone, North Carolina. I hope you're enjoying the virtual conference so far. Today, we're joined by Raymond, Moon, and Andrew from the Alder Graduate School of Education. If you've ever wondered what exactly are they doing in technical services, what are they doing back there, then I think you're going to enjoy this discussion. The presentation is entitled, "What I Wish I Could Tell My Public Services Colleagues, Perspectives from a Startup and a Technical Services Side." So I hope you enjoy this presentation. Feel free to use the chat, shoot me any questions, shoot them any questions. And I look forward to enjoying the presentation. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Sorry, I apologize. I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulty in getting our slides back up. So before we get the slides back up on the screen, how about we do our introductions? So my name is Moon Kim. I'm the Acquisitions Librarian at California State University, Fullerton. I will also have to apologize because outside my window there's gardeners cutting down a tree. So I will be mostly muted to kind of cancel out the background noise, but I will chime in whenever possible and I'll be monitoring the chat. Andrew?
Hi everyone, my name is Andrew Carlos. I am one of our STEM and Web Services librarians at Cal State East Bay, which is just south of Oakland in California. I'm here, my role in this presentation is really to serve as the public services side of things with a little bit of experience in technical services. So I'm here to learn just as much as everyone else is.
Hi everyone, this is Ray. I apologize. It seems like the slides are stuck in another window. I had to turn off another email address because it was making a lot of noises. Apologies for that. I'm going to bring it up right now. But as we are speaking, oh, somebody has that up. Thank you, Moon. As we're speaking, I'm Ray Pun. I'm an instruction librarian at Alder Graduate School of Education, which is based in California. So I used to be at the California State University system as a first-year student success librarian and working closely with Moon and Andrew in our different consortiums and activities. So we really wanted to have this opportunity to have an open discussion, hear your thoughts, maybe address some sort of misconceptions and ideas about what it is that technical services folks really do from our perspectives. And I should say right now at my startup university, I'm a technical services librarian as well. So I handle a lot of collection and acquisitions work. And so, you know, that's sort of like the gist of it. We're trying to encourage to have discussions on this manner. And if we can just go to the next slide, would be great. So we've done our introductions and then we can go to the next slide. So where is everyone from? So please feel free to interact with us and type in the chat box. I know there's only a few of us, so you're welcome to share where you're located. We're all located in California, and I'm not sure if we win the award for being the furthest, but that's something to think about. Okay, we got some folks chiming in. Okay, so cool, we have folks from North Carolina and Illinois, San Jose, California, Chicago. Great, so we have folks from all over different parts of the country. That is awesome. So I think one of the things, you know, the bulk of this talk is really to look at why we have focused on technical services. And in the next slide, you see basically, oh, should I bring up this? Oh, okay, there we go. Slides are coming back up. Yeah, you could just move to the next slide. Yep. Thank you. So you can see with the memes here, a lot of people tend to think that technical services tend to be focused on cataloging. So it's even in popular culture, in these sort of visuals you see here. And how do we address like this issue where it's actually not just technical service, it's not just cataloging, but other matters as well. Next slide, please. So the question that we're going to be trying to zooming in is, what do technical services folks really do besides cataloging? And so it's something that's really remarkable because, as we all know, we're all library professionals. There are an array of workflows. And in the next slide, you'll see that these are just examples of different kinds of charts and resources management beyond cataloging, right? So that's the assumption that a lot of public services folks, including myself, we know that there are groups like acquisitions, e-resource management, and cataloging. Those are the three, but we may not realize that there are actually many multiple functions as well. And then now transitioning to the technical services side, I personally see it quite differently. And in the next chart, you'll see basically how important it is, how connective it is to other areas of the library, including IT, collection development. And so that's sort of like a sort of overview of how different workflows appear to be. And I think Moon had found this article, and I'm not sure if you wanted to just say a few words about this before we move on to the next activity.
Hi. So one of the things that I think is hinted at in this slide is that technical services is also incredibly collaborative. And technical services folks often overlap with public services because we all work together to facilitate discovery and access to resources. So even though we may not always directly work with the public, I really feel like our job is really inherently public services as well. So next slide.
Yep.
Actually, one thing I want to add is for a lot of people, they see that there's definitely a divide between technical services and public services. But in discussions that I've had with a lot of colleagues lately, is we really come to the realization that technical services is just as much public services as public services is, because the work that they do makes our resources like visible and accessible to the public. So it's really hard to really differentiate between the two. Like technical services may have their specific roles and duties, but what they do really affects like the public's perception of our work.
Yep. That's right. That's right. And in our next activity for all of you, if you want to type in the chat box, sort of looking at this Likert scale from a 0 to 5, you could sort of put your number up. If you are 5, if technical services is your life, is all you've been doing. 4, mostly doing technical services work. 3, I do some of one of them and public services. 2, I do mostly public services with some technical services work. 1, I occasionally help out with technical services work, or 0. What's technical services? AKA, I do 0 technical services work. So please feel free to participate. What am I gonna do?
So I see that Scott occasionally helps out with technical services work. Andrew is mostly public services, but does some tech services, similar with Grace. Ray is somewhere in between. So I think it's really great that we have such a variety of folks doing different levels of technical services work.
All right, so yep, that is correct. Let's move to the next slide. So we have these discussion questions, and we want to just go around with the 3 facilitators, Moon, Andrew, and I, to just sort of talk through it. And then if folks have other comments, please feel free to type in the chat box. So our first question is really database trials, right? We think about that, but from which lens? We know that technical services and public services, they both define it very differently. And we have to look at it from that lens. And then the second question is, how do I negotiate with vendors based on my experiences as a public services librarian. And that's also quite interesting. And maybe we'll start with Moon. Do you have thoughts on the first question?
So because I've always done acquisitions, I really feel like acquisitions kind of sets the groundwork, at least in the systems that we utilize to manage our workflows and inventory. But really, the core of the technical services work really stems from the individuals who work with our patrons, especially in the selections they do, whether we opt in to purchase ebook packages or to trial databases. Database trials typically kind of stem with collection development's decision to move forward on a public services need. So typically, there are so many layers that are involved, from the point of even kind of discussing licenses, even reviewing sample licenses, to having the database trials running and making sure it's accessible to the individuals who need it. And even at the level of getting survey responses from the trial participants. So Ray, do you want to maybe comment on how your public services perspective influences how you might negotiate with vendors?
Yeah, I also wanted to add that from a public services lens for the database trials, it comes off from our perspective of making sure that we have something for duration, right? As opposed to figuring out the workflows from behind the scenes, as you were alluding to. And so from our experiences, really negotiating with vendors, now I'm doing more technical services work, but like a year ago, I'd probably be a 0 or 1, and now I'm more like 3.5 or 4 from that scale. It's more important to really connect with all these different stakeholders. So as a public services librarian, we have to really recognize the different response needs and the expectations from our stakeholders. And we do this all the time, right? I mean, this is not necessarily a technical or public services thing, but in public services, we work closely in the academic context with our departments, with our liaisons, and then sort of talk to the vendors and see what can be addressed. So for instance, if you're supporting, or if you're a liaison to a first year writing program and you need this sort of ebook that needs to be available for multi-access use, you would work with the collection librarian and then see if that's possible to develop a sort of a trial or some sort of to negotiate with the vendor to get these resources available for all the first year students. Obviously that's an extreme sort of hypothetical example, but that's sort of like how the workflow is from the public services side. And I would just sort of end it on that note that it's quite a interesting process if you're doing both work. So right now in this new university, I'm working as a technical services and public services. I just go directly, and then I talk to the faculty directly. So it's just, there's sort of a less handover going on. Andrew, do you want to add any thoughts to this?
Yeah, I want to say it's actually really interesting, having never run any database trials on my own and not even knowing like how the workflow for getting a database trial set up. It's interesting to hear from both Ray and Moon's perspective about like getting feedback from public services librarians. I will say we just recently started a trial for Sanborn Maps database, and that probably wouldn't have even come up if I didn't hear back from one of my faculty members who really needed some GIS and data mapping software. And had I not shared my experiences as a public services librarian to our e-resources librarian, we wouldn't have even set up that database trial. So it's interesting to hear from other technical services librarians their perspective on database trials.
And you're welcome to respond to those questions if you like, folks, in the chat box. I brought this question up because I feel it's interesting. Back where I had worked before, there has been a lot of expectations that database trials could be set up like automatically and immediately, just based on a couple of conversations. In fact, it's quite convoluted from behind the scenes to get that conversation going. So, I think this sort of dispels this sort of myth that there is not a lot of workflows around it, but actually there's quite a lot of work of managing and also assessing the data usage and getting that perspective from your stakeholders. So if you're in technical services work side and you have public services colleagues, you need to get those input from their constituents to really validate whether this is worthwhile to pursue. Yeah.
And I will admit, as someone that has only worked in technical services my entire library career, the feedback that we get from not only our liaison librarians who work with faculty members, staff, and students are so critical important in determining what we decide to move forward in terms of collection development or acquisitions decisions.
Yeah. Next slide.
So what I'm hearing is I should really give feedback, and I'm really bad because I don't give feedback. So I should feel really guilty about not giving feedback, is what you're saying.
Yes, providing feedback is incredibly useful because, I mean, the public services side is really the ones that see how our users are searching databases, what their behaviors are, what they're using, what they need. We, if you're an individual that works completely in tech services and do not have any public services duties, you're not always aware of what the institutional needs are. So oftentimes what I do is I do typically reach out to our public services folks just to say, hey, is this what you guys need? Especially if they don't provide feedback. I do try to go out of my way to reach out to them. I know we're all busy juggling tons of different things. And I especially understand that public services folks often have varying schedules because they have different, instruction sessions or reference duties. So, they're not always at their desks monitoring their emails, but I always do try to follow up with my colleagues to make sure that the database trials, to make sure, one, they have access to the database trials, and to see if, this is something worth pursuing further.
Yeah, the other point is, this is right, if there are multiple trials going on at once and you have a limited budget, and then it comes down to deciding which one you would choose to, be the one that you would subscribe as a library, but you're competing with each other. You're basically essentially competing with different department needs, constituent needs, and your colleagues' needs. So from there, it comes down to, at least from what I've seen, it's a vote down. Like everyone just comes to a collection meeting and then we vote which ones would be viable, and based on the feedback that you've received. The feedback is key. So if you wanted a health science database and you had it on trial versus an English database and you had that on trial, and if the English database received a lot more feedback, a lot more usage just for that trial, this is coming from a public services side, then generally we have that evidence to indicate the English database would be more useful. So I think the feedback part from the lens I'm using right now from public services is quite important. So discussion 2, where do contracts, agreements, and licenses go? And why do databases take so long before becoming accessible? I think we kind of hit some of this stuff, but I will say that it is interesting, just from my experience working in the startup, figuring out, well, where do they really go? Like, I don't know exactly how to handle these contracts aside from reading them and then realizing that they need to be stored properly in a repository. But I'll default it to our in-house expert here, Moon, to give some context from her end.
And actually, our Ms. 3 made a really good comment regarding our last discussion question and said, I think it's important for tech services and user public services to work together holistically. What we do is for the public and for them. So we need to know what they need and how they use it. If they don't know what we have, what we're doing, and why, they're not using the resources as effectively as they should. And I think that's an excellent kind of bridge to our discussion question 2, because we also need to be responsible financial stewards, especially because I've always worked in public state institutions. I always feel this kind of responsibility to our taxpayers to ensure that we're utilizing the fiscal funds in a very responsive way that really, is working for our users and beholden to our taxpayers who are funding our institutions. So speaking of financial matters, I will briefly kind of talk about the contracts, agreements, and licenses. There are times, well, one, where do the contracts, agreements, and licenses go? It really kind of depends on your local setup, and it varies really across different institutions. Some institutions might opt to store them separately in print folders or filing cabinets. Others might store them online. A lot of it has to do with the records retention schedule of your individual institutions. At the Cal States, we're a consortium of 23 universities, and as a system, we have a system-wide records retention policy, and it does allow for electronic storage as well. And it just so happens that all 23 campus libraries migrated to Ex Libris's Alma and Primo in the summer of 2017. So we are gradually moving more towards storing our licenses and contracts in our integrated library systems. Ray, what do you guys do at Alder?
So in terms of the contracts and agreement licenses, as I was mentioning, I've been just putting them in a folder on a Google Drive, and we're in a process of creating an internal staff use page, a repository. So that should go there eventually, and then just in case if we needed to re-review the contracts, we have them all in one location. But for folks who generally have worked in public services like myself, recognizing that this is really interesting. I had no idea where those contracts were kept other than possibly the administration's office or the collection librarian's office. So, having those sort of understanding, it gives us some sort of sense of accountability. And then another question right here about the databases taking so long, I think it's just really setting up that process of authentication, of developing sort of solutions to make sure that things become available to a certain extent. I think this is
oh, question. Sorry.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why database setups or trials might take a bit longer than you expect is sometimes it's because when we're doing purchasing or sending out orders or anything like that, before all the business terms kind of take place, we often negotiate our business terms and licensing terms before even setting things up sometimes. And one of the reasons why contracts, agreements, and licenses are so important, especially in the technical services realm, is because we need to know, one, what our entitlements are, and two, the kind of division of responsibilities. So what we as institutions are responsible for, like, for example, like making sure we don't do some weird kind of like systematic downloading if our license doesn't permit it. And two, what our vendors' responsibilities are, like whether they're supposed to be hosting the data or giving us notice if there's any changes to their data, things like that. So that's where having access to your contracts become very critical in terms of, knowing what you have and whose responsibility it is when something could maybe go wrong. And it sometimes also governs different terms in terms of if there's an annual access fee, you agree to pay a certain amount within a certain period of time. So aspects like that are considered more kind of business terms. Why do databases take so long before becoming accessible? That's because sometimes, the negotiation process between technical services and the vendors might take a while. There could be varying degrees of IT setup that's required. I think Ray alluded to this as well, but sometimes depending on your own institutional IT infrastructure, you might have to get your IT involved to proxy in for resources, especially for off-campus access. So there are multi reasons why things can take long. But there are also other times when you might think it might take really long to negotiate with, for example, a streaming media vendor, but it turns out they have a sample license that's actually really excellent, and all the business terms go swimmingly well. In those cases, sometimes things can, databases can get set up without any kind of delay. So it does happen where things can happen really quickly, but the flip side is there could be a lot of back and forth, whether it's, just communication or agreeing on terms or coming to a consensus on what you want to achieve together.
And I think that's the hard part too, is that sometimes a lot of the back and forth is not visible or known by public services. So like, we are in the middle of upgrading one of our SpringShare products, and we have kind of had a big delay on implementing it because our head of acquisitions has to consult with the legal counsel for SpringShare and with our IT on campus, because all of our resources that we connect on our library website have to be compliant with 508. So we have to go through this thing called a VPAT process, which I can't remember what VPAT stands for. Moon, do you know what VPAT stands for off the top of your head?
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I'm the worst with acronyms.
It's
But
like voluntary
product accessibility something.
Yeah, so basically it's a little form that our vendors have to fill out to say that like, these are how our resources are accessible to your patrons or to your users. So it's a accessibility services kind of like pre-approval, and we are kind of at a standstill. We've been waiting for like at least 2 months for our vendor and for our IT folks to get together and actually approve the VPAT form. So that's where the delay's been. And had my office not been next to our head of acquisitions office, I wouldn't have known where we were at. And I would just be like, what's taking so long? So sometimes things that are taking the longest are things that like are out of our control. Like they're with our vendors and they're with our IT, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So it's kind of a bummer. And I think one thing that would be really helpful from the public services side is to really be transparent about like what's taking so long in the process, so that people don't necessarily get frustrated with why databases take so long to become accessible.
Yep, that's a great point. And Moon had put in the chat box VPAT, so that's Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. So feel free to look it up afterwards. Next and final question. Thank you. Discussion question 3. How do technical services librarians troubleshoot when e-access goes down? So I will say for my own experience so far, when things go down, there is a workflow, a process. Well, at a startup context, you kind of just figure it out as you go. I've talked to my IT group and figure out a solution and an idea of trying to get it going, especially for accessing a certain database with mixed authentication sign-ons and figuring out the best way to get it going because it's not working for some of the folks. And so my dean and other faculty, they would just email me directly when they don't have access or when I need to troubleshoot. So I immediately have to resolve this as soon as I can. But that's my context because I'm able to do that at this context, meaning it's a priority and we just run things really fast. But for an established university or like where Moon is located, she might do it differently. And I'll pass it to her to share her experience.
Sure. So at a lot of larger institutions with very kind of divided workloads, you might have a lot of flowcharts and workflow diagrams to see who handles what. And that is typically the case when, a lot of the tech services responsibilities are distributed. So, I handle the acquisitions and truly just the acquisitions piece, but there are times when e-resources go down and we do have 2 ER librarians at my institution, but sometimes they kick things over to me because sometimes they might have originating issues with payment or something like that. So the most basic level, you want to narrow it down and try to troubleshoot what the origin of the issue is. Sometimes it can be local where, if it's in the acquisitions realm, it could have been, oh my gosh, our order has lapsed and therefore our publisher might have decided to pull our access. But there might be other times where, it can also be your kind of institutional IT, like a power server, some kind of power area went down and no one on campus has access to anything on anything. That has happened where I worked once. There might be other times where vendors are having issues with their servers, or it could be they're upgrading from an HTTP to a more secure server, and sometimes the links don't work as correctly. So you often want to have those conversations with vendors. And one of the things I also do, because in the Cal States, we're part of a consortium of 23 libraries, I sometimes just bounce things off of my colleagues or my counterparts on other campuses just to say, hey, our access to EBSCO something went down. Are you having this issue? Then if others are having similar issues, then I can kind of narrow it down to maybe the vendor having issues. But if it seems like it's just me, then sometimes I check locally to see what's going on my campus too. You always want to kind of loop in the vendor just in case it is something on them as well. Or if there's something on our side that they're privy to that my institution isn't aware of, that's always very helpful too. Sometimes it could just be our access doesn't have to do with any sort of access issues, but we just loaded the incorrect discovery record. So sometimes our cataloging has to get involved. So a lot of times you want to try to narrow down to what the root cause is. And that's always a really tricky part because you don't always know. So you have to kind of go through a lot of different scenarios before you get to it. And I think as a technical services librarian, one of the hardest parts is when access goes down and it's not within my control. So if it's within my control, of course, I'll find every means to kind of restore access in a very responsive and timely manner. But if it's something on the vendor side, we often have to put out a notice or some kind of alert to notify our patrons and our public services colleagues that, hey, this database is currently not available. We expect it to come back at this time. Or, hey, I think the vendor is going to be doing maintenance on this particular weekend. So please notify your students, faculty, and staff that there might be no to limited access for certain electronic resources.
And I think that's probably the most important thing for public services librarians to know is to have some sense of like where we're at, when you're troubleshooting e-access. So like one thing that we've actually set up on my campus is one of our SpringShare products has like a system status dashboard where you can input all of your databases and then all of your web resources. And then you can say like, this tool is down because of blah, blah, blah. And it gives you like a little alert and it shows on the side of our database page, like which resources are available and which resources are not. So I think things like that, like things that are very transparent and make it obvious to not only users, but also to your public services colleagues would be really nice, because then we know that like things are being worked on. And I think that's always been the hard part for me is like, since I straddle both public services and technical services, there's been times where I've had to troubleshoot e-resource access. And it's just like, I sometimes forget to tell people like where I'm at, where I'm troubleshooting. Like I sometimes forget to tell them like, I'm in contact with a vendor, and it's just like out in the ether. And my colleagues are like, what's going on? Like, how come we haven't gotten any updates? And I just have to like, remember, like be communicative. Like as Scott pointed out, good communication is key when you're troubleshooting access issues.
Great, and now we are up until the last slide almost. We have about 10 minutes. And really, we want to open up this to a conversation for all of you. If you feel like you want to respond to some of our questions, thoughts, comments, please feel free to type in the chat box, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and speak along. So anyway, open to your thoughts for the next 10 minutes before we wrap up. So, I will have a question actually for Moon. So you had mentioned that there are two e-resources librarians at your workplace, and that seems interesting because where I've worked, there's always been like one. I've never heard of two, but I'm sure that's common as well. So I guess my question is, when you have two folks, in the same title in these specialized roles, do they already have the responsibilities divided up, or are they sort of like working in parallel with each other?
Actually, I think I might have misspoke there. We currently have one ER librarian, and we have an open search for another ER librarian. I'm used to having two, so that's probably why I said that. And I will admit some of that's kind of historical. So prior to migrating to Alma, we had two separate ER librarian positions at my institution because their roles were really tied to the electronic resources management products used to kind of facilitate access to electronic resources. So one person was really kind of in charge of the one ER librarian position was really in charge of a system called Verde that kind of has a lot of like financial and licensing information. And then our other ER librarian position was really responsible for maintaining our linking our link resolver. So his position was really rooted in a system called SFX, which is an Ex Libris product. Since we have migrated to Alma, we're finding that there are a lot of opportunities to kind of merge some other roles, but also because we were going through a consortial migration that kind of added an extra layer of complexity, we really appreciated having two ER librarians kind of tackling ER from very different perspectives. So that's kind of been why we've traditionally had two ER librarians, because their positions were really kind of tied to different products. Moving forward now with Alma, we're kind of envisioning new responsibilities for our ER librarians, and I don't see any signs of their workload lessening because we're also an e-preferred campus, so most of our content is electronic. So you can imagine most of the kind of feedback that we get from our patrons are usually for electronic resources versus physical resources. I feel like Cal State Fullerton, we were also in a very unique situation because we also had another position that was our copyright and licensing librarian who really did the negotiations. Over time, that person's role kind of got distributed because that person moved into a more management role, but we were incredibly fortunate to have so many individuals really focused on our electronic resources, because that's been the bulk of the feedback that we get from our constituents. Electronic resources access, which has been very critical in maintaining a really good relationship with our campus community.
So Scott asked a really interesting question. Implications for libraries that are considering reorganization. Do you think the technical services department will exist in exactly the same form as many libraries switch around traditional departments? Andrew or Moon, if you want to say something.
I mean, I'm gonna flip back a couple of slides to the chart that Moon had found about how technical services basically has like their finger in a whole bunch of different departments. I think if a library is reorganizing itself, wow, that sounded so weird, is reorganizing itself, there's probably a good chance that technical services as it exists now will be changed or renamed, or just like they're going to reimagine how technical services is going to be, because they have to be really aware of like how their role affects a whole bunch of different things. So I think in a future reorg, technical services won't exist as its own department. It'll be something completely different. It might be merged maybe with like access, or maybe even merged with public services, because their roles are so like intertwined, is my feel.
Yeah, and even that chart, even in that article, the author kind of did a survey on the various different technical services organizational models where, oftentimes a lot of tech services folks are kind of under one kind of manager or associate dean, or kind of like AUL, associate university librarian position. But there, I think, was one organizational model where even acquisitions and cataloging reported to completely different managers. So, I mean, I personally feel that as a lot of our work is changing, like even in my organization in particular, so our cataloging department has been very focused on MARC cataloging historically, but now that we've kind of transitioned into a more consortial shared bibliographic management system, a lot of our cataloging labor is now kind of looking towards more metadata initiatives. So in the Cal States, we're also implementing a consortial institutional repository system. So our catalogers becoming more and more involved with, metadata for digital objects and institutional repositories. So I don't know if organizationally, we will always kind of stay in a similar structure, but I feel like the really amazing part about being a technical services librarian is a lot of what we do and a lot of our skill sets and expertise can be repurposed in many different manifestations. So one of the things that I'm always looking at as an acquisitions librarian is kind of what's going on with open access, because as someone that has been kind of practicing, Lorcan, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Lorcan Dempsey from OCLC, but Lorcan Dempsey talks about this kind of notion of outside in and inside out collection. So outside in is where, you're bringing in external content into your own institution. So for example, that's, what acquisitions and ILL does when we bring in, content generated from, different scholars around the world into our local institutions. But inside out is where we're kind of pushing our local content out to the rest of the world. So as someone that's been really practicing the outside in model, I always look to the other side of the spectrum of looking at the inside out model to see where we can converge and how our workflows can maybe overlap or reach some kind of a halfway point.
That's a really great point, Moon. And I wanted to mention this comment that was brought up in the chat by Armize. When e-resources were just taking off, people thought keyword searching would be sufficient and cataloging would not be needed anymore. It's true that the ways we catalog change, but it didn't take long for people to see the real need for metadata, sophisticated metadata, because of the myriad types of institutions and purposes that needed to be accommodated. Even if it's not so-called technical services, there will always be a need to structure the data and keep it corralled. So that's a great point. And we're down to our last minute. So if you could just move on to the last slide, Andrew. So thank you again for coming. Really insightful conversations. Obviously, we've only scratched the surface. There's a lot more discussions about in terms of technical services work in public services area and vice versa. And I think that it comes down to communication, but more about really thinking innovatively for collaboration and responsiveness. So that's sort of like my last thoughts. Any other last thoughts from Andrew or Moon?
I think we've had a really great discussion this afternoon, I guess. It's still morning for us. And I really appreciate everyone's comments in the chat.
Yes, since we're literally down to the last minute now, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And hope you had some interesting technical services takeaways that maybe you can utilize in your own institutions as well.
Any more last minute questions? If not, I'd like to thank our presenters, Andrew, Moon, and Ray. Thanks to everyone for participating. Thank you for your comments. It was a great discussion. I think we still have at least an hour to another couple hours of tracks in this virtual conference, so I'd encourage you to check those out if you're interested. And if there's nothing else, we're done. So thank you and have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.